You were never meant to hear this story. Not in churches, not in schools, not in any history book written for public eyes. Yet here you are. And once you step through this door, there is no turning back. Imagine a family whose name itself was whispered as a curse, the Damnations. Their bloodline carried something more than sin, more than greed. It carried a hunger, a system of control so dark that to even speak of it was to invite its shadow into your own life. The story begins not in scripture, not in law, but in whispers carried by dying men across the American frontier. They spoke of redemption camps, holy places that promised salvation, but instead harvested suffering like cattle led to slaughter. The Damnation family preached purification, but their gospel was carved into flesh, burned into bone, and buried beneath the soil of Texas swamps. When federal officers stumbled upon the remains in 1881, they expected to find fanatics. What they uncovered instead was a criminal order, an empire of torture masked as faith, deception polished as salvation, and ledgers that recorded not sins, but profits. This was not religion. This was machinery, designed to strip men of guilt, women of dignity, and children of future. A machine that fed itself on human fear and grew stronger with every body lowered into its unholy earth. And tonight, you will learn their story. But understand this, knowledge is not neutral. To know of the Damnation family is to carry the burden of what they unleashed. By the end of this journey, you will not see faith, power, or obedience the same way again. I want you to prove to yourself you can handle this descent. Right now, tell me in the comments what state or what country you're watching from, because this isn't just history. This is about where you stand in this exact moment as the line between the damned and the awakened is drawn. If you're still here after hearing this much, then you are ready to walk deeper with me. But before we continue, one request: subscribe to this channel now, not for me but for yourself. That way, you never lose the trail when truth begins to slip through the cracks of the stories you were raised to believe. Are you ready? Then hold your breath, because once the Damnation family steps onto the stage, there will be no comfort, no redemption, only revelation. Every legend begins with roots buried deeper than anyone dares to dig. The Damnation family did not appear out of nowhere in East Texas in 1845. No, their arrival was only the blossoming of seeds planted generations earlier, seeds soaked in blood and deception. Their ancestors, whispers say, were not ministers at all, but slave traders operating along the Mississippi River, men who understood that the human spirit, when broken, could be sold and resold more profitably than flesh alone. From these men came Malachi, Cornelius, and Jebodia Damnation. The brothers carried letters of recommendation signed by respected ministers across the South, forged, bribed, or perhaps willingly written by men too eager to believe in holiness. But their true authority came from something else entirely: their command over the psychology of guilt. Malachi could stare into a man's eyes and recite sins he had never confessed. Cornelius could strip a soul bare with questions that cut deeper than any blade, and Jebodia, built like a blacksmith, claimed his hands had been blessed for healing. But it was pain, not mercy, that poured from his touch. The frontier was fertile soil for predators like these. Texas had just joined the Union, and the land was crawling with fugitives, deserters, gamblers, whores, and men broken by war. They came seeking escape from their sins. The Damnations promised them cleansing. What they delivered was annihilation. Their camps appeared almost holy. White tents arranged in perfect circles, a towering cross at the center, and nightly sermons where flames leapt high into the sky. Travelers described weeping crowds begging for salvation, convinced they had stumbled upon prophets of God. But behind the sermons was an iron structure, the ledger. Every confession, no matter how small, was written into those books. A man's entire soul reduced to ink, and once recorded, it could never be erased. This was the true power of the Damnations. They didn't just punish sins. They collected them. They turned guilt into property, shame into leverage. If a man failed purification, his sins were still useful. They could be sold, traded, or whispered to enemies. It was the earliest form of spiritual blackmail, a weaponized religion designed to control not just the body, but the legacy of every sinner who crossed their path. And as their reputation grew, so did the number of bodies disappearing into shallow graves. Few noticed at first, The frontier swallowed the missing like the ocean swallows ships. But one survivor would soon return to town, gaunt, trembling, his hair turned snow-white overnight, with whispers of the pit that never stopped screaming. The year was 1847, and at the town of Marshall, Texas was still little more than a scattering of wooden buildings carved out of pine and swamp. On a blistering August evening, a cattle driver named Samuel Hartwell stumbled into town. What should have been a familiar face to the locals looked like a corpse walking on borrowed time. His once muscular frame had wasted to bones, his hair had turned shock white, and his eyes, those eyes no one could forget, carried a horror that spoke of things too dreadful for words. When townsfolk asked what had happened, Samuel whispered a single name: Damnation. At first, no one understood. He spoke of a camp of fire, of prayers twisted into curses, of digging his own grave while being told it was the path to eternal life. He spoke of a pit where screaming never ceased, where bodies writhed beneath the soil until silence claimed them. Samuel's words came in fragments. He would fall into long silences, his body trembling as though he still felt the lashes of whips embedded with shards of iron. But in his moments of clarity, he revealed enough. The process began with fasting, 7 days of water only, while digging your own grave. Then came the confession extraction. Cornelius' damnation would force a man to vomit every secret of his soul, scribbling them into the ledger. If a man held back, Jebediah's hands would remind him, pain so sharp it seemed to carve memory from flesh itself. And when every sin had been revealed, the trial of fire began. Whips, flames, and the ritual of burial. A man laid alive in his own grave, covered in soil, until breath itself became sin, begging to be cleansed. Some were pulled out again, screaming and broken. Others were not. What disturbed the town most was not his story, but his conviction. Samuel insisted that death in the pit was declared by Malachi as perfect purification. The victims' names were written in the ledger of the redeemed. Their deaths were not called murder. They were called salvation. At first, local authorities dismissed Samuel as another drunk haunted by frontier guilt, but the townsfolk saw the truth in his eyes. This was no madness. This was a man who had seen something no human should see. And within a month, Samuel vanished without a trace. The legend of the Damnation family had only begun to whisper through East Texas. But now the whisper was spreading. By 1849, the frontier was already littered with missing names. To most, it was nothing unusual. The West devoured the reckless and the guilty. Men fled debts, women fled shame, soldiers deserted their posts. But those who looked closer began to see the shadow wherever the damnation camps appeared. Disappearances followed like wolves stalking cattle. Letters reached families in Louisiana, Arkansas, and Mississippi. They were written in the hand of the redeemed. Sons and daughters who claimed they had been transformed, reborn, and now called to missionary work in far-off territories. The words were convincing. They spoke of repentance, of divine fire, of carrying the gospel into Oregon, California, even into Indian lands. But none of those names ever appeared in church rolls, nor in missionary records. It was as though their salvation had been purchased with their silence. One mother, Ellen Westbrook, refused to believe the letters. She hired investigators to track her son Thomas, a gambler who had joined a camp near Shreveport. The trail went cold. No mission, no church, no son. What she did find, however, were rumors, whispers of shallow graves of men purified through death. The letters, she realized, had been forged. The hand imitating Thomas's was precise, but wrong in ways only a mother could see. The more one studied the damnations, the clearer the pattern became. Their sermons were bait, their ledgers were chains, and their graves were the altar. They were not just preachers, they were harvesters. And here is where you, the listener, must decide if you are willing to look deeper. Because hearing this is not harmless. To understand the Damnation family is to risk carrying their shadow inside you. If you've stayed with me this long, I need you to prove it. Comment the phrase, "I bury nothing," not once, but twice below. That phrase will mark you, not as prey, but as one who refuses to let secrets be buried in shallow earth. It is a signal both to yourself and to this community that you will not turn away. The authorities of the time dismissed all of this as hysteria. They looked at letters and saw faith. They looked at graves and saw tragedy. But what they could not see or refused to see, was the design. The Damnation family was not chasing redemption. They were building something far more dangerous. From the outside, the redemption camps of the Damnation family looked almost holy. Neat rows of tents arranged in perfect circles, a towering wooden cross at the center, and fire pits that burned through the night. Strangers passing by saw only devotion. They heard hymns echoing in the dark, the sound of prayer rising into the pines, and assumed they had stumbled upon a revival of the purest kind. But appearances were the first trap. Step inside the circle and you were already caught. The first rule: surrender everything. Clothes, money, weapons, even your name. You were stripped, wrapped in rough burlap, and branded not with fire, but with identity erased. You were no longer a man or woman of flesh, but a penitent soul, and your body belonged to the brothers. The second rule: confess. Days were spent in endless interrogation, Cornelius' Damnation writing with feverish hands into the ledger. The ledgers were not books of faith, they were inventories, detailed records of sins that could be turned against you at any time. Even the smallest transgression, a stolen coin, a broken promise, a lustful thought, was etched into the permanent record. If you failed to remember, Jebodiah's hands would guide your memory with pain so sharp you would beg for the chance to confess. The third rule: obey. Silence at night, prayer at dawn, labor during the day. You dug your own grave while fasting, convinced this act symbolized your spiritual death and rebirth. But in truth, the grave was preparation, not metaphor, but destiny. Many who dug never stood above ground again. The fourth rule: endure. The trial of fire was not a single act, but an escalating ritual of torment. Whipsoon with fragments of iron lashed across skin until flesh tore like cloth. Flames licked at bare feet as Malachi's voice thundered scripture over screams. And the final test: burial. Dirt pressed against your chest, filling your lungs with the weight of silence, while the brothers prayed above your shallow grave. For some, the soil was pulled back just before death. For others, it was left to settle forever. These camps were not places of worship. They were factories. They broke men down, ground women into silence, and rebuilt survivors as hollow shells. The Damnations called this purification, but in reality, it was programming. Every man or woman who walked out alive was not free. They were owned. Not all who entered the camps perished. Some crawled back into the world, but they were never the same. Survivors carried an aura that unsettled even their closest kin. They spoke in monotone, their eyes hollow, their movements slow and deliberate, as though a part of them had been left behind in the pit. They prayed endlessly, but their prayers were not of joy or thanksgiving. They begged God to forgive them, not for what they had done, but for what they had seen. Neighbors whispered about these revenants. They startled at sudden noises. They woke screaming at night. They recoiled from touch as if human warmth itself had become unbearable. And yet, they never spoke against the Damnations. Not once. It was as if some vow, unspoken, unbreakable, sealed their mouths. One such survivor was Jacob Miller, an outlaw who had sought redemption after years of theft and bloodshed. He returned from the camp thin, broken, but oddly serene. He told his family he had been cleansed. Yet each night, they heard him whisper in his sleep. The pit never stopped screaming. His wife reported that he would sometimes rise in the dark and stand barefoot in the yard, staring toward the horizon as if waiting for a signal only he could hear. Another was Sarah Colby, a woman who abandoned her children to a brothel and sought salvation at the hands of the Damnations. She returned with eyes that no longer recognized her kin. Hours passed with her sitting silently, whispering prayers no one understood. Her sister later swore Sarah spoke of watching others buried alive, and asked God to forgive her for not stopping it. Even men of the cloth were not immune. Reverend Peter Hawkins, a Methodist minister, entered a camp to study the brothers' methods. He returned shattered. His journal trembled with fragmented lines. "This is not God. This is something else wearing God's face. To speak it aloud is to invite it nearer." He stopped preaching altogether and vanished within a year. The survivors were not merely traumatized, they were transformed. They carried a fragment of the Damnation gospel within them, like a seed planted in fertile soil. Wherever they went, they sowed unease, spreading whispers of fire, graves, and purification. The Damnation family had discovered a sinister truth. Killing a man silences him, but breaking him ensures he carries your message into the world. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, blood spilled across the land. Brother against brother, neighbor against neighbor. Entire towns burned, families fractured, and men vanished into battlefields from which they never returned. For most Americans, this was tragedy. For the Damnation family, it was camouflage. The brothers no longer had to explain missing men. A son lost to the camps was assumed to have died in combat. A daughter who vanished was said to have fled the destruction. Every disappearance was swallowed by the war's endless hunger. And so the Damnations thrived. They built moving camps that followed the marching armies. On the edges of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Missouri, they set up tents under the guise of traveling chaplains. Soldiers broken by horror flocked to them, desperate for absolution. Some left with a prayer, others never left at all. Cornelius, the ledger keeper, expanded his role. He began forging letters for soldiers redeemed in the camps. Mothers received words of comfort written in their son's hand, claiming he had gone to preach in faraway lands. Widows received confessions of love and forgiveness, but the men who supposedly wrote these letters lay in unmarked graves, their names added to the Damnation's ledgers of the lost. Malachi preached with greater fire than ever, declaring the war itself as proof of God's wrath. "This land burns," he thundered, "because sin has consumed it. Only the pit can cleanse you." His sermons drew hundreds, sometimes thousands, and in that frenzy, it became impossible to know who stayed and who was stolen. But it was Jebodiah who adapted most chillingly. As armies clashed, he prowled the battlefields at night. Soldiers swore they saw him moving among the corpses, dragging the wounded into wagons before their comrades could claim them. Some lived to crawl back to their regiments, whispering of a giant with fire-lit eyes who promised salvation but carried them into hell instead. Most did not crawl back at all. The Civil War masked their crimes, but it also gave them something new: legitimacy. No longer mere shadows, the Damnations were recognized by some as prophets of fire. Even generals, desperate to inspire faith in their men, allowed the family to preach in their camps. Few realized they were feeding their own soldiers to a cult of death. By 1865, when the war ended, the nation was shattered, and the Damnation family had grown into something larger, darker, and far more dangerous. They were no longer wanderers. They were an institution. When the Civil War ended in 1865, America staggered like a wounded animal. Towns were in ashes, fields abandoned, and thousands of families waited for men who would never return. It was the perfect soil for despair, and the Damnation family planted themselves deep into it. They no longer roamed like vagabonds. Instead, they built settlements. The first appeared in western Kentucky, a village of wooden cabins arranged in a circle around a towering pit of stone and ash. They called it the Furnace of Grace. On Sundays, smoke rose from the pit, mingling with the ringing of iron bells. To the desperate, it looked like holy revival. To those who peered too closely, it smelled of burnt flesh. But no one dared question. Who would? These were years when starvation haunted every home. A family that joined the Damnations was guaranteed bread, shelter, and protection. Cornelius controlled the ledgers of rations, ensuring loyalty through hunger. Malachi promised eternal salvation, convincing followers that suffering was proof of God's favor. And Jebodiah enforced obedience with fists and fire, ensuring none broke rank. Soon other furnaces rose, one in the hills of Tennessee, another hidden in the Ozarks. Each was built with the same geometry: circular homes, central pit, watchtowers at the edges. Outsiders described them as fortified towns of prayer. Insiders called them the hallowed circles. Those who entered never quite left. Merchants who traded with the Damnations reported seeing children with hollow eyes carrying baskets of bones as if it were normal. Travelers spoke of night rituals where the congregation chanted in perfect unison, their voices rising like a single beast. And there were rumors, dark, consistent whispers, of processions leading into the furnace pit, where the unredeemed were thrown into the flames while hymns drowned out their screams. The most chilling detail: local authorities looked the other way. Sheriffs claimed they had no jurisdiction, or that the Damnations were religious folk. Some were bribed, others converted. A few who tried to investigate disappeared. their badges later found nailed to the wooden gates of the furnace towns. By the late 1860s, what began as a family of 3 brothers had swollen into a following of hundreds, perhaps thousands, not by force alone, but by offering something war-torn America craved: meaning. They gave the lost a place to belong. They gave the starving food, and for those drowning in guilt, they gave the illusion of redemption. But at the heart of it all, the pit still burned. And with every new settlement, the damnation gospel spread like wildfire across the South, a faith built not on salvation, but on terror. By the 1870s, whispers of the damnation family had reached the pulpits of traditional churches. Baptist ministers, Methodist preachers, even traveling revivalists began warning their flocks. Beware these false prophets of fire. They do not bring salvation, only death. But those who raised their voices against the furnace towns rarely lived long enough to repeat their warnings. Reverend Amos Fletcher of Arkansas stood before his congregation one Sunday and declared the damnation's a disease upon the Lord's body. A week later, he vanished on his ride home. His horse was found wandering near the river, saddle torn, but the reverend's body never surfaced. In Missouri, an entire congregation disappeared. Witnesses said the church doors were barred from the outside during evening service. By the time locals rushed in, only smoke and ash remained, and no trace of the faithful who had gathered that night. Some whispered they'd been taken to the furnace pits, fed to the fire in one of the damnation's mass purifications. Over and over, the same pattern: anyone who dared speak against the family was silenced, not just killed, erased. And yet their influence didn't spread only through fear. It seeped through imitation. Smaller churches, desperate for the same fervor that filled the damnation's congregations, began borrowing their methods. At first, it was only the chanting in unison, then came the fire rituals. Soon entire denominations warped under the shadow of the furnace gospel, blending Christianity with something older, darker. By 1875, towns across Kentucky and Tennessee began to resemble damnation settlements. Outsiders couldn't tell the difference between a traditional church and a furnace town unless they stayed long enough to hear the hymns twist into howls or smell the smoke that clung too long in the air. A former priest, Father Keenan, who barely escaped one such congregation, wrote in his journal, "They wear the cross, but they worship the pit. Their sermons quote scripture, but their eyes shine like beasts in firelight. They do not preach God. They preach hunger, and the people kneel because the people are starving." The most terrifying part, the line between the furnace gospel and mainstream religion blurred until no one could say for certain where one ended and the other began. The damnation family was no longer a fringe cult. They were becoming a religion. By the late 1870s, the damnation family was no longer a whisper in rural taverns or backwoods chapels. They were an open wound across the South. Settlements that grew into fortified towns, congregations swelling by the thousands, and stories of vanishing travelers spreading into newspapers. Local sheriffs had failed. Pastors had failed. Now, Washington could no longer ignore the damnations. In 1878, the federal government dispatched marshals into western Kentucky to investigate reports of mass disappearances linked to a settlement near the Cumberland River. Witnesses described the town as eerily silent upon the marshals' arrival, homes abandoned, doors swinging open in the wind. But the pit still smoked. Inside the furnace circle, the marshals found burned remnants, twisted iron shackles, charred hymnals, and what one official later described as hundreds of human teeth scattered in the ash. No survivors, no bodies, only the stench of fire. The newspapers reported it as the collapse of a fanatic commune. But locals knew better. They claimed the damnations had been warned, that their followers melted into the countryside long before the marshals arrived. And in the years that followed, new furnace towns appeared farther south. In Alabama, Mississippi, even the swamps of Louisiana. The government tried again in 1882, this time with soldiers. An entire regiment was ordered to dismantle a Tennessee furnace and arrest its leaders. Days later, survivors stumbled back to Nashville with a story too bizarre to print. They swore the town had been waiting for them, chanting as if the soldiers were expected. And when they tried to storm the furnace pit, the ground itself seemed to ignite, swallowing men, wagons, even horses into flame. Out of nearly 100 soldiers, fewer than 20 returned. The rest were never seen again. After that, federal efforts dwindled. Officials branded the Damnations a local religious sect and advised citizens to avoid their settlements. Behind closed doors, whispers suggested the government feared another confrontation would cause open rebellion. But the truth was darker. Every failed attempt to suppress the Damnation family only fed their legend. To their followers, the government's defeat was proof of divine protection. To outsiders, it cemented the Damnations as untouchable, an empire of fire thriving within America's borders. By the turn of the century, they were not merely a family, they were a kingdom. By 1900, the Damnation family was no longer just a southern phenomenon. Their settlements stretched like a dark chain through Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Each one built in the same design, the circle of cabins, the watchtowers, the furnace pit at the heart. Outsiders whispered that if you drew their locations on a map, the pattern formed a serpent slithering down the Mississippi. But the family was not content with America alone. In 1903, a group of their preachers boarded a steamship in New Orleans. They carried no luggage, only trunks filled with blackened hymnals, iron brands, and jars of ash from the original furnace of grace. Their destination, Brazil. Why Brazil? Because its backlands were filled with poor, isolated villages. The same kind of desperate soil that had once nurtured the furnace gospel in America. Reports soon emerged of American prophets, building fire pits in the jungles, luring peasants with promises of salvation through burning trials. Within a decade, Damnation missions sprouted in Haiti, Cuba, even West Africa, wherever hunger and despair left people vulnerable. The gospel of fire was no longer bound by borders, it had become an export. Missionaries described their sermons as mesmerizing. They preached in broken tongues, yet somehow their words cut through language like a knife. And wherever they settled, the same stories followed: night chants, disappearances, the acrid stench of smoke in the trees. Back in America, the original family glorified these missions as proof that their destiny was not local but eternal. Malachi's descendants preached that the furnace was not just for America, but for the whole world. Even governments began to notice. In 1911, the French colonial office in West Africa reported the destruction of 2 villages allegedly tied to a foreign fire cult. In 1914, Cuban authorities banned Damnation gatherings after locals accused them of feeding prisoners into the pit. But bans and threats only made the gospel spread faster. For the Damnation family, persecution was fuel. Every attempt to suppress them became a testimony to their followers. The world feared their truth. Every closure of a furnace only sparked 3 more in hidden valleys and foreign ports. By the 1920s, the Damnation family was no longer just a shadowy American sect. They were a transnational movement, with leaders who spoke of fire as if it were a kingdom without end. And yet, at the heart of it all, their settlements in the American South still burned, still chanted, still watched the furnace, pits like holy altars. Because no matter how far they spread, the root of their power remained in the soil of the United States. And soon, that root would twist upward in ways no one could control. The stock market crashed in 1929, and the United States fell into ruin. Banks shuttered, families starved, men wandered highways with empty pockets and hollow eyes. But where most churches faltered under the weight of despair, the Damnation family only grew stronger. To the hungry, they offered food. To the homeless, they offered shelter. To the hopeless, they offered fire. In the backwoods of Kentucky and Tennessee, furnace towns turned into sanctuaries for the broken. Long bread lines wrapped around the circles of cabins. Desperate families traded their names, their past lives, and even their children in exchange for belonging. The Damnation preachers promised not survival, but rebirth. "America has failed you," they cried, "but the furnace will never fail. Burn away your poverty and rise again in flame." And people believed. The newspapers began to notice. By 1932, the Chicago Tribune ran a piece titled, "The Church of Ash, Depression Cult or Salvation." Reporters who ventured into the furnace towns described surreal scenes. Men dancing barefoot on glowing coals, women branding newborns with iron sigils, whole congregations singing in eerie unison as smoke poured from the pits. But not all reporters returned. One journalist, Clara Hayes, vanished while investigating a Damnation town in Alabama. Her last telegram, sent hours before she disappeared, contained just 3 words: "The fire breathes." Rumors spread that the Damnations had begun moving into cities, disguising themselves as storefront churches and soup kitchens. To the average citizen, they looked like charitable ministries feeding the poor. But to insiders, the sermons carried the same twisted gospel: redemption through fire, loyalty to the furnace, and the promise of eternal unity in ash. By the mid-1930s, law enforcement estimated the Damnation family numbered in the tens of thousands, not just a cult, but a movement woven into the very fabric of Depression America. And yet, behind the charity, their old practices never stopped. The pit still burned. The disappearances continued. Children raised in the furnace towns grew into soldiers of the gospel, spreading their parents of faith with fanatic devotion. The rest of America saw suffering and collapse. The Damnation family saw opportunity. The world was falling apart, and they were building their kingdom from the ruins. When America entered World War II in 1941, millions of young men were drafted and shipped overseas. Among them were hundreds of Damnation sons, boys raised beside the furnace pits, taught from birth that loyalty to the family outweighed loyalty to any flag. For the U.S. Army, they were just recruits. For the Damnation family, they were missionaries. Reports from the Pacific Theater told strange stories. Soldiers who fought beside Damnation men described them as fearless, almost eager to die. They carried small jars of ash around their necks, rubbing it on their wounds instead of bandages. Some were seen praying over enemy corpses, whispering the furnace hymns before setting the bodies alight with stolen fuel. One officer wrote in his diary, "They don't fight for country, they fight for fire. And when they kill, it's not war, it's worship." In Europe, Damnation soldiers slipped into bombed-out churches and dug pits in the rubble, conducting midnight rituals that unnerved even hardened veterans. Rumors spread that they converted fellow soldiers, preaching that war itself was a furnace, burning away the weak, leaving only the chosen ash behind. Back home, the family thrived. While the nation rationed food and gasoline, furnace towns somehow never went hungry. Some whispered that Damnation preachers had struck deals with corrupt officials, funneling supplies into their settlements. Others claimed darker things, that missing ration trucks had been emptied into the pits, both cargo and drivers alike. By the war's end in 1945, something had changed. The Damnation family was no longer just a southern cult. They had tasted global blood. Their soldiers returned from overseas carrying stories, trinkets, even recruits from shattered nations. German, Japanese, Italian converts quietly filtered into the settlements, swelling their ranks with a new, international edge. And for the first time, the family began speaking not just of salvation, but of dominion. They claimed the war had proven their prophecy, that fire was the only true God, and nations were nothing but kindling waiting to be burned. In secret gatherings, leaders preached that the next great furnace would not be dug in the woods, but lit across the entire world. And in the shadows of post-war America, as the Cold War dawned and fear hung heavy in every household, the Damnation family grew bolder than ever. The Cold War was a time of suspicion, witch hunts, and fear. America saw communists lurking in every corner, infiltrating schools, churches, even the government itself. And the Damnation family, masters of disguise and manipulation, seized the moment. They rebranded, no longer calling themselves the Furnace of Grace or the Church of Ash. They appeared under names that sounded perfectly patriotic. The American Fire Fellowship, Citizens for Eternal Vigilance, the torchbearers of freedom. To the outside world, they were simply fiery anti-communist congregations. They flew American flags outside their chapels, preached about God and liberty, and condemned godless Marxism with an almost fanatical zeal. Politicians, desperate for allies in the cultural war, welcomed them. But behind closed doors, their sermons remained the same. The pit still burned. The hymns still echoed. The fire was still God. The genius of their disguise was simple. In a world terrified of communism, anyone screaming loud enough against the Red Scare was seen as a friend. No one dared to question the strange symbols carved into their hymnals, or why their patriotic rallies always ended in bonfires that burned long into the night. By the 1950s, Damnation chapels had spread into suburbs, small towns, and even cities. Housewives brought their children to Sunday services where lessons against communism were blended seamlessly with furnace doctrine. Young men enlisted in militias sponsored by the patriotic church, training in the woods with guns by day and chanting around fire pits by night. A 1957 FBI memo, now declassified, described them as one of the most fanatical and elusive sects in America. They cloak themselves in patriotism, but their loyalty lies elsewhere. Their true allegiance is not to the United States, but to the fire they worship. Still, the government never made a full move against them. Why? Because in the age of McCarthyism, to accuse a church of being un-American was political suicide. The Cold War gave the Damnation family exactly what they needed: cover. They multiplied in plain sight, weaving themselves into the American fabric while whispering, always, the same prophecy, that one day the fire would consume the whole world. And by the time the 1960s arrived, with civil rights marches, riots, and war protests shaking the nation apart, the Damnation family saw their next great opportunity. They would not hide anymore. They would step into the chaos, and they would feed it with fire. The 1960s were supposed to be the decade of peace, love, and freedom. But in the shadows, chaos ruled: assassinations, riots, Vietnam, and an entire generation of youth searching for answers in drugs, communes, and radical movements. The Damnation family saw not rebellion, but recruitment. They opened their arms to the disillusioned. Hippies drifting through San Francisco, New York, and Los Angeles stumbled into peace fellowships that promised community, purpose, and firelit rituals that felt spiritual, almost tribal. To a generation that had lost faith in government, church, and family, the Damnation gospel of burning away the old to be reborn in flame felt intoxicating. Their communes spread like wildfire, from abandoned farms in Oregon to crumbling factories in Detroit. Free, living, Damnation houses attracted thousands of young followers. Outsiders thought they were just another cult among many, like the Hare Krishnas or the Children of God. But inside, the pits glowed hot, and the same old furnace hymns rose into the night sky. Even music wasn't safe. Underground bands tied to the family wrote songs laced with furnace imagery, lyrics about ash and unity and burning away the past. Some tracks made it onto vinyl, hidden among psychedelic anthems, played at protests and love-ins where thousands sang along without realizing what they were chanting. But not all recruits joined willingly. The family knew how to prey on runaways, addicts, and drifters too far gone to be missed. Police reports from the late 60s mention bonfire communes, where missing persons were last seen. Their families never found them. The real turning point came in 1969, the same year as Woodstock, the moon landing, and Charles Manson's bloody crimes. While the world was shocked by the Manson murders, few noticed a far stranger series of fires in the Midwest. In rural Ohio and Indiana, entire communes went up in flames. Local authorities claimed faulty wiring, gas leaks, or freak accidents. But whispers spread that these weren't accidents at all, that they were rituals. Neighbors swore they saw figures dancing in the firelight. Survivors, pulled from the smoke, muttered about a trial by furnace, where the weakest were left to burn and the strongest walked away purified. And yet, no charges were ever filed. Like always, the Damnation family slipped back into the shadows. The summer of love had ended in fire, and the family was stronger than ever. Because while hippies burned out, overdosed, or dropped out, the Damnations endured. They had taken the restless, the lost, the angry, and molded them into fire-breathing believers. And as America stumbled into the 1970s, exhausted and paranoid, the family prepared to spread into the one place no one ever thought to look: the suburbs. The 1970s and 1980s were decades of transition. America traded its flower crowns for briefcases, its communes for cul-de-sacs. The counterculture burned out, but the Damnation family didn't vanish. It evolved. The tight dye, the wild hair, the open bonfires, all of it was shed like snakeskin. In its place came polished suits, manicured lawns, and smiling preachers with shining teeth. The Damnation family infiltrated the suburbs. They opened sleek new churches. No more barns or dirt pits, but gleaming auditoriums with sound systems, choirs, and children's programs. To the outside world, they looked like just another wave of evangelical megachurches sweeping America. Inside, however, the core doctrine never changed. The furnace had simply gone corporate. Instead of raw bonfires, they built sanctified furnaces in the basements of their chapels. Steel doors, exhaust fans, ritual chambers disguised as utility rooms. The hymns were rearranged into upbeat praise songs, their cryptic lyrics about fire and ash hidden behind smiling melodies. Parents brought their children to youth groups where lessons about morality mixed seamlessly with furnace philosophy. Teens were told the world is corrupt, only fire can cleanse it, and you, chosen one, will carry the torch. But their greatest trick was politics. In the age of Reagan and the rise of the moral majority, the Damnation family blended perfectly into the new wave of religious conservatism. They preached against drugs, against communism, against moral decay, gaining allies in high places. Senators shook their hands, governors attended their prayer breakfasts, money flowed in, and beneath it all, the furnace roared. A chilling discovery from 1983 proves it. During a police raid on a Damnation church in Kentucky, authorities found a locked chamber beneath the sanctuary. Inside, scorched bones, melted metal, and hymnals blackened by soot. Yet the case never went public. Within weeks, records disappeared. The lead investigator resigned, and the church reopened as if nothing had happened. By the end of the 1980s, the Damnation family was no longer fringe. They were embedded in suburbia, woven into America's very heartland. To neighbors, they were model citizens, polite, prosperous, God-fearing. But at night, behind closed doors, they whispered the same prophecy Esperanza de Lima had carved into firewood centuries earlier: the world is kindling. One day, all shall burn. And as the new millennium approached, their ambition grew bolder than ever. Because for the first time, the Damnation family realized something chilling. They no longer needed to hide. They had become the system. The year 2000 arrived with glowing screens instead of glowing fires. The world was no longer gathering in chapels or communes. It was gathering online, and the Damnation family adapted instantly. Their sermons became television broadcasts, aired on small local networks that grew into national syndications. Their hymns, once whispered around bonfires, slipped into Christian rock albums, pop singles, even movie soundtracks, stripped of overt references but still carrying the coded language of ash and fire. By the 2010s, they no longer needed to recruit in person. The internet did it for them. YouTube channels live-streamed sermons, motivational podcasts, all carrying the same subtle themes: the world must be cleansed. Only fire purifies. Those who resist will burn. They looked like wellness coaches, spiritual gurus, lifestyle preachers, but the furnace still burned behind every word. And here's the part no one wants to admit: they may be closer to you than you think. That cozy suburban megachurch down the street, that influencer preaching radical self-purification, that community group obsessed with burning away the old world. Check their symbols, listen to their hymns, watch how they end their gatherings with candlelight, fire pits, or burning paper slips as offerings. Because the Damnation family never died. They never vanished. They just stepped into the future, carrying the same fire Esperanza de Lima lit over 3 centuries ago. And now, their reach is limitless, no longer confined to plantations, communes, or chapels. They are everywhere, hidden behind screens, streaming into millions of homes every single day, and their prophecy still hangs over us all. The world is kindling. One day all shall burn. The real question is, when that fire finally comes, will you be outside watching it spread, or inside the furnace, singing with them?